Here we are, the latter part of week 7, really starting to bed down the course and wrap it up, right? So, as I said in the screencast this week, what I really expect you to be doing is thinking a lot more about your final paper and thinking about organizing yourself for the final exam that's going to come out on Monday than engaging in this sort of course. But I did want to point out that you do have some great readings this week. I think there's a lot to be learned from engaging in our case study this week, which is about climate change. And again, much like last week, because we're in these modules that are more about discussion of, the particular examples, this is not a lecture in the clearest sense, but instead sort of a get started process, right? Like, so I'm giving you some kindling is one of the pedagogical terms that we sometimes call this, right? Some things to think about to get the thought process going, right? So let's think about one particular kind of thing, and I think this is really important. One of the ways I like to try to situate when we think about climate change politically, right? And remember, when we talk about politics, often bears mentioning that what we're doing is we're thinking about the process by which who gets what, where, when, and how, right? And the fact that is deeply imbued with power. One of the ways I like to start thinking about climate change in terms of politics is to think about what Kant called an imperfect duty, right? So for Kant, one had a duty to do something if they could actually influence the world. If something was outside of your control, you really couldn't be reasonably held accountable for it, right? But if you did, if something that happens and it's very clear that both it was preventable and that you or other particular person could have prevented it, we can say that person had a duty, right? They were supposed to do that morally. And failing to release that duty is also something that we punish in society, right? Either socially or legally in some instances, right? This is sort of the idea of like gross negligence, right? So this is the idea that we can actually stipulate things about our world that represent duties, and we can organize ourselves around that principle. But what about the idea that there are things that are very specific that could be prevented, but it's not immediately clear who can do it, right? And how they would go about doing it. This is what Kant said was an imperfect duty. So his thoughts are a little bit more complicated, but the basic gist here is this. Imperfect duties are where society has a duty to fix or prevent something, that there is a capacity to do that, but it's not immediately clear who individually is supposed to carry that out, right? I bring this up because I think it's really sometimes productive politically to think about climate change as an imperfect duty, right? What makes climate change incredibly tricky then is a series of characteristics that ultimately define how we think about it socially and politically, right? So this is a process of what Foucault called problematization, right? So there's something about our world that we want to change, but we're going through a process of trying to figure out how we should think about that thing and what it would mean to go about changing it, right? So there are some things that make the problematization of climate change, like making it a problem and establishing that certain people have a certain duty to do a certain thing, right? That are difficult here. One is that it's non-localizable and it's not clearly separate from other forces. This is just, quite frankly, something that human beings have a really hard time dealing with our linear way of thinking, right? What it means to be non-localizable is that you can't just locate climate change in any one place, event, or time, right? So just because a single season is wetter, drier, or cooler doesn't locate climate change. Instead, climate change emerges from longer-running trends that are only visible through statistics. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And it's not clearly separate, right? So California wildfires, Midwestern droughts, thawed mountain peaks are common occurrences that are exacerbated by matters not immediately associated with climate change, like agricultural practices and natural temperature variations. But climate change clearly influences these effects, making them more intense, more frequent, which is to say they happen more often, and more common. They happen in more places, right? The other thing is that for Western societies, the concepts of politics, society, and economic growth simply lack an ecological idea. This has to do with very early liberal social contract theorists like Locke, where the environment was understood as a vast, unending, and truly limitless expanse bequeathed by God for man to make something out of. Of course, these notions were developed at a time when the human population was a fraction of what it is now, but it is a basic foundation that shows up in a lot of discourses about climate, especially climate skeptic ones, right? The idea that the environment is simply too big and too broad and too deep for us to meaningfully influence it, right? Now, the fact that that's scientifically untrue is an illustration of the fact that these kinds of discourses clash. Also, the influences of climate change on the future are difficult to understand, largely because we really don't have great models of thinking about our future or our environment that aren't based on statistics or extrapolated trends. And again, the scientific consensus is very clear, but that is hard for people to grapple with when it doesn't show up visibly, tangibly in their own lives. And it's not immediately clear how they individually would be held accountable for doing something about it. If the weatherman, I've heard this before, if the weatherman got the forecast wrong today, how can they tell me what will happen in 50 years? If you're watching the news, you'll know that actually a bunch of scientists from oil companies actually predicted what would happen about 50 years ago, and it turns out they were right, but the skeptical discourse has persisted all the while. And then also there's an inbuilt inequality effect, which is going to be deeply political and will reflect power, which is that many of us will pay a monetary price for the effects of climate change, and that will be largely indirect. So that means higher heating and cooling bills, higher taxes to pay for infrastructure changes, etc. Where climate change will be the most directly impactful are in lesser developed states and places. While unlikely to create conflict in itself, droughts and natural disasters worsened by climate change may make conflict more severe and protracted, and I would add to this, may make economic growth slower and may actually contribute to things like mass migration, right? So it's important to note that these characteristics are underlying a lot of how we think about the climate discourse. And we can actually start to identify different discourses about climate change, whether it is or is not a threat, and then what to do about it. So it's important to note that discourses around climate change do exist, and that these are constantly interacting, shifting, and competing for influence in our societies. What's important, however, is that while each may appear generic or organic, they manifest a specific set of assumptions about the world in each case, right? Basically coming down on how do we turn climate change into a duty, and what does that mean? Who does it? How do they do it? And how do they go about doing it? Knowing that and then tracing the relative influence of each step, we can analyze the context in which climate change is discussed and therefore how it politically begins to emerge as a problem. So one of those discourses is elitism and skepticism, right? So this discourse points to the meaning-making and visibility-creating that is necessary to identify climate change. So this includes scientific data, statistics, complex computer models, and recursive research. Here, the contingency of these efforts is itself focused on being somehow flawed or driven only by elite considerations. So confidence intervals, competing studies are used as a foundation to claim that the science is not settled, but these traits are just as clear in other domains of science and engineering as in climate change, right? So one important example is airplane design and engineering, where up until very recently, actually some of the mathematical models we had for figuring out how to design airplanes didn't coincide with each other, right? But we were still able to build airplanes. Another discourse is techno-scientific. So this discourse sees human ingenuity as synonymous with our agency and thus points to technology as a foundation for thinking through climate change. What this means is we tend to take climate change as a fact, but we see no real need to adopt different ways of thinking, different consumptive patterns, or anything else. Instead, we look at massive technical projects that will salvage our world. So Elon Musk's gigafactories, climate engineering, and other climate mitigation mega projects are important parts of this discourse. So here, climate change is not a problem of human action or consumption. It's a technical problem to be solved through technology. And then the third discourse is liberal choice, right? A core tenet of liberal political philosophy is the ultimate authority and accountability of the individual. So if the individual can't, and this is where the Kantian thing is important, right? This is a key aspect of Western political thought and is integral to our ideas about democracy, the role of the state, and how we think about complex topics like freedom. In relation to climate, this discourse tends to see climate change as something that the individual can alter by, say, avoiding beef, cattle create more CO2 than cars, buying higher electric vehicles, or reducing one's carbon footprint in general. This tends to desecuritize climate change and make it a matter of consumer preference. And that also produces very particular dynamics. So this list is not exhaustive, and I'd like to see each of you attempt to add to this list. But what it points to is the idea that there are clear identifiable discourses with different formations and different resulting practices that shape how we think about climate change. Each of these is self-referential in many ways. They refer to ideas we have about science, technology, and rights, rather than the climate itself, which is why it's really important to think about discourse and processes when we think about things like climate change. All right? So that's all I got for you today. Thank you very much. Looking forward to your final papers and discussion forums. I hope you have a wonderful remainder of your week.